Good morning. Thank you, Colin. Thank you for that kind introduction. It is great to be with you this morning. I want to start by extending my gratitude to my friend Arthur Brooks for his decade of inspiring leadership here at AEI and for his leadership in the conservative movement throughout this country. And I also want to thank Colin Duick for very kindly moderating today. Fortunately for us, our subject matter has seldom been more pivotal or urgent for the future of our nature. That is the question of our foreign policy, its purposes, its goals, its execution, and who determines it. In order to tackle these questions, we need to answer the first question, which is, what should our foreign policy be overall? The late celebrated political scientist Edward Corwin called the Constitution an invitation to struggle for the privilege of directing American foreign policy. That being said, in a system where there are complementary and competing roles for each branch of government, the Senate is entrusted with a robust role in determining foreign policy. Many historians and statesmen have recognized the Senate's disproportionate weight on questions of war and peace. As Henry Cabot Lodge said, war can be declared without the assent of the executive, and peace can be made without the assent of the House. But neither war nor peace can be made without the assent of the Senate. Or at least, that was the case for generations of statesmen. It is because of the Senate's dereliction of this particular constitutional duty that we have seen 20 years of foreign policy varying widely in goals and outcomes, strategies and executions, seemingly without continuity from one administration to the next, and often without any sense of continuity even within an administration. And that is where we will continue to find ourselves, with the pendulum of our foreign policy swinging unpredictably without the strong stabilizing role of the Senate. Perhaps the key reason the Senate has declined its role as a stabilizing force is that it's much easier to dump all your problems on the executive branch rather than to affirmatively declare war, to make peace, and to draw real lines in the sand. At some point in the last few decades, senators realized that that responsibility can be more of a liability than a privilege, because it means you have to argue your case, deliberate, decide, and live with the consequences. For the last several decades, American foreign policy has been seen as a tug-of-war between intervention and isolationism. In the wake of 9/11, it's been intervention that's been on the ascendancy. But it has often been implemented by both parties in ham-fisted ways that have had no clear goals, exit strategies, or benefit to the vital national security interest of the United States. Even leaders who started out winning Nobel Peace Prizes and going on tours to prove their world citizenship soon became known for drone strikes and botched regime changes. It would take a dozen speeches to outline each of the many failures and successes in detail between the Bush and Obama administrations. And we'd spend even more time arguing which was which. But perhaps we can all agree mistakes were made. In reaction to many years of such mistakes, and in some cases disasters, an opposite, isolationist reaction has found new supporters in American politics. And understandably so. A national examination of conscience is a good thing. But we should not rush into the arms of isolationism, as if it were a reasonable alternative to intervention. As if our only choices are to bomb the world into democracy or ignore the world into peace. It is not a binary choice. There is a third option, not an intermediate point between the other two, but rather a third point on the triangle. national interest. We should be intervening, or not, and deciding what form that intervention should take, based directly on America's national interest. Now that may sound like common sense, except it hasn't been. Since the end of World War II, generations of intelligentsia have maintained a glowing crush on Marxist regimes the world over and wanted the United States to operate from a position of guilt for its greatness and regret for its victories. The late, great Jeane Kirkpatrick famously rebuked this attitude when she excoriated the Carter-era weakness which time and time again ended up benefiting the ideological enemies of the United States. Instead, she proposed a different standard of action, that America act primarily in its own interest, that it support friends and destroy enemies, and that it do so judiciously and decisively, instead of engaging half-hearted measures that inevitably slide down to defeat. Her ideas went on to become a cornerstone of Ronald Reagan's foreign policy. Notice that this did not result, as the naysayers predicted, in World War III. It didn't result in reinvading Vietnam or directly fighting the Soviets in Asia or Africa. Indeed, the largest military intervention by Ronald Reagan was Grenada, where our military stamped out a Marxist junta in a matter of days. But his strong vision and moral clarity transformed the world. This standard, the national interest standard, is still rejected by many today. Some have never met a country they didn't want to invade. Others have never met a theater they didn't want to abandon. Neither is the right answer. Instead, we should be fierce and resolute in defending America and defeating our enemies. But we should also be extremely reluctant to intervene militarily and risk the lives of our sons and daughters. I guess you could call me a non-interventionist hawk. One reason for a bias against intervention is that so often, under both Republicans and Democrats, our interventions have become unmoored from America's national interests. Uncle Sam has developed a bad habit of attempting to topple dictators who are killing terrorists, only to have them replaced by terrorists who kill Americans. We saw that in Iraq. We saw that in Libya. And had the proponents of intervention in Syria's civil war prevailed, we very likely would have seen that in Syria as well. At the same time, when we're dealing with an Iran or a North Korea or an ISIS or Al-Qaeda, we should be fierce and unequivocal, because each of them directly threatens the lives and safety of Americans. When you apply a consistent standard to various situations, when you ask the central question, is this in the national security interest of the United States? You can get different results. Results that sometimes please the interventionist and sometimes please the isolationist, but arise from neither of their principles. And sometimes that puzzles outside observers. Even though we should be reluctant to use force, we still need a strong military, the most powerful on the globe. But even though is the wrong relator. It is because we are reluctant to use force that we need a strong and powerful military. This has been called peace through strength, and it's absolutely right. The more prepared we are to defend ourselves, the less likely we are to actually face military conflict. That's why I've been a leading proponent of the biggest military rebuild since Ronald Reagan, which we are in the midst of right now today. In the last Congress, I passed a measure mandating for the first time that the Defense Department begin implementing a test bed for space-based interceptors for missile defense, and also introduced legislation moving forward plans to develop a robust space force. We should be generally skeptical about the use of force, let alone the endless wars that America has been fighting. But if force is necessary, we must be ready and able to make that force unstoppable. Beyond ensuring a strong military, let's take a look at how the national interest standard applies in practice. First, we have to be better at choosing the right instruments for the appropriate national security interests. It can't be diplomacy all the time, nor can it be guns blazing all the time. We have a hierarchy of tools. We have our voice, the bully pulpit of the United States, a powerful, powerful tool. We have economic and diplomatic sanctions. We have targeted military force. And we have overwhelming military force. Each has its place. Our voice should be clarion. Clear and understandable, speaking truth. Tyrannies fear the truth. Dictators fear the sunlight. They shudder from it. Reagan illustrated this powerfully when he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. The intelligentsia in Washington recoiled. But speaking the truth pierced into the darkest prison cells. Natan Sharansky, with whom I had the great pleasure of visiting in Jerusalem, has described how prisoners in the Gulag passed notes from cell to cell, repeating Reagan's words, evil empire, ash heap of history. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Those latter words are the most important words ever spoken by a leader in modern history. The history behind those words is notable. 3 times the State Department, this is too belligerent. It's too hostile, and more importantly, it's too unrealistic. Mr. President, this will never, ever, ever happen. And 3 times Reagan, with his own hand, wrote the words back into the speech, replying with a characteristic twinkle in his eye, you don't understand. This is the entire point of the speech. And just 3 years later, the Berlin Wall was torn to the ground. America had won the Cold War without firing a shot. It's one of the most remarkable achievements for peace humanity has ever seen. Through renewed strength, which bankrupted the Soviet Union, and the moral clarity of America's voice, the Soviet Union collapsed. When it comes to tyranny, when it comes to human rights abuses across the globe, we should use that voice across the world. This is something too often the isolationists don't understand. That just because you may not be prepared to send in the Marines doesn't mean America should be silent in the face of human rights abuses and injustices. Sunlight and transparency is itself a powerful, powerful tool. The next tool is economic and diplomatic sanctions. A tool to change the behavior of others, and we should use it vigorously against America's enemies. Whether Iran or North Korea or Nicaragua, America's economic weight can be a powerful, powerful tool to constrain their aggression and to weaken their despotic regimes. The next tool is military force, targeted or overwhelming. The former is appropriate for terrorists, from ISIS to Al-Qaeda. The latter, which we should use very, very rarely, should be the standard if we are ever called to direct military conflict. We are deeply reluctant to fight. The threshold for putting our children in harm's way is extremely high. But when we do fight, we win. And we bring our boys home. Now let's now look around the world at how this standard would apply in practice. We have to acknowledge the world as it is. There are friends and enemies. There are rivals and problematic allies. There are human rights crises. Each of these requires different approaches. What tools we use, how we use them, depends on who we're dealing with and what is in America's national interest. Let's break down the world into 4 baskets. Baskets that our country should handle differently depending on the contents. Number 1, friends. Number 2, enemies. Number 3, rivals. And number 4, problematic allies. We'll start with our friends. And I'll use an obvious example near and dear to my heart. Israel. It's our top ally in the Middle East. And it's not simply a charity case, as sometimes public discussion suggests. We get much, much more in terms of strengthening American national security, in terms of logistics and intelligence, from the $3 billion a year in military assistance. If America tried to recreate what we get from our alliance with Israel, it would cost many billions more than standing alongside our friend. Israel is key to the safety and security of Americans both at home and abroad. It's the very definition of a friend. So how do you treat an ally? Well, I'll tell you how you don't treat them. You don't go to them and lecture them and tell them where they should draw their borders when they're constantly being attacked by enemies. That's simply hubris. President Obama, sadly, was unremittingly hostile to the state of Israel. In December 2016, his administration maneuvered the United Nations to pass UN Security Council 2334, which condemned Israel and was so broad that it would make it illegal for Israeli Jews to build homes in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, Israel's capital. What a disgraceful, dishonest endeavor for American diplomats to participate in, much less to orchestrate. Instead, we should be supporting the authority and autonomy of our allies by putting our embassy in their actual capital. We should support their claims to territory rightfully gained in defensive wars, territory necessary to their continued protection. That's why I've been leading the fight to officially recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, won in a defensive war and critically necessary for Israel's security given Iran's presence in Syria. And that effort is seeing growing bipartisan support in both the House and Senate. That's also one of the many reasons that I advocated that the United States move our embassy to Jerusalem, which was the single most powerful signal the Trump administration could send that America had returned to standing behind our allies. There was a vigorous debate within the administration. Both state and defense opposed moving our embassy, but thankfully the president agreed and did so. And with that single act, the Trump administration rebuked Resolution 2334. It should be, and increasingly is, a dead letter. Then there are regimes which are clearly, undeniably, enemies. It is in our national interest to confront them. Here I part ways, not just with liberals, but with isolationists in both parties. Some tend to look at enemies and see potential friends, and they downplay the need for economic, let alone military pressure. The results are often naked appeasement, sometimes line drawing with no plan for success, and always disastrous. Iran is an enemy. The possibility of a nuclear-armed Iran is the greatest national security threat facing America across the world. I urge the President to withdraw from the disastrous Obama-Iran nuclear deal. Yet again, both state and defense oppose this move. But yet again, thankfully, the President agreed. And pulling out of that deal was the single most important national security step taken in the last 2 years. Instead of sending the Ayatollah billions in the dark of night, we should be imposing maximum economic pressure on Iran. For that reason, last Congress I introduced a bill, the Blocking Iranian Illicit Finance Act, that would fully cut off Iran from the global financial system. I'll be reintroducing it this Congress as well. Enough is enough. And if we ever discover that the Ayatollah is on the verge of getting nuclear weapons, and I believe his ambitions will continue to be to do just that, we should be prepared to use crushing military force to make sure that doesn't happen. Military force to destroy their nuclear capacity. That should be our objective. Why? Because that's what our national interest is. To prevent an Ayatollah who chants death to America and death to Israel from ever having weapons capable of murdering in a flash of light millions of American souls. Now, critically, if it ever comes to military conflict, our objective shouldn't be to invade and try to turn Iran into some sort of democratic utopia. Instead, it should be to defend America and prevent a nuclear Iran. Clear, simple, focused, with an unmistakable endpoint. Likewise, North Korea is an enemy. They threaten us. They threaten South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, all our friends. Kim says repeatedly he's willing to launch nuclear weapons at the American homeland. It is both a military challenge and a human rights catastrophe. Here I push that we use all of our tools, from missile defense to using the bully pulpit to highlight the plight of seized and murdered Americans, such as Otto Warmbier. And if military intervention becomes the only way to stop a nuclear attack on American cities, then of course we have to be willing and able to do so with overwhelming force. And that unequivocal promise, by the way, is our single best hope at deterrence. Third, there are countries which are not enemies, but certainly not allies, which are rivals seeking to undermine and surpass our influence. I'm thinking primarily of Russia and China. Now, it's a practical matter. We have to do business with them. The global economy is intertwined, but we have to make sure we're aware of the risks and deal with open eyes with those risks. And we need to make sure we're maintaining a robust military to deter those rivals. We need to make sure we're protecting our allies from them. And we should be prepared to use sanctions and diplomatic pressure where necessary. China is undeniably our top geopolitical rival. Russia is second, and I'm glad that the liberals have recently discovered that. It's about time. Some of us remember Barack Obama turning to Mitt Romney in 2012 and saying, Mitt, the 80s have called and they want their foreign policy back. All we needed was President Trump for liberals to suddenly discover Russia's a bad place and Putin is a bad guy. I'll take late rather than never. Dealing with China is fraught with risks, from espionage to full-born military threats. For too long, we failed to acknowledge the risks from China. We had our own Defense Department funding Chinese Confucius Institutes, which are programs at American universities that the Chinese say are for building cultural ties, but instead are being used for espionage. We likewise allowed the Chinese to participate in RIMPAC naval exercises, the world's largest military warfare exercise. In the last Congress, I introduced and passed legislation prohibiting both of those foolish practices. This Congress, I'm reintroducing the SHEET Act, more broadly targeted at stopping Chinese espionage in higher education, a growing threat to intellectual property and to national security. We need to make sure Taiwan, Japan, Ukraine, and other allies are protected from these hostile rivals. I've long pushed to expand port calls with Taiwan, for instance, and to share more military information with them. Finally, there are problematic allies. Here again, we come to Jeane Kirkpatrick. We have problematic allies across the world. Those who are merely the lesser of two evils, whose continued existence prevents far worse violence or instability. We should be pressuring them to improve and reform, while working with them in ways that concretely advance American national interests. Turkey and Saudi Arabia are problematic allies. Mubarak was a problematic ally. What the Saudis did to Khashoggi was wrong. It was horrific, state-sponsored murder. But nobody is under any illusions about the morality of the Saudis. In the Middle East, there are a lot of problematic actors. And the Saudis are a regional counterpoint to the Iranians, who are led by a genocidal maniac who wants to murder Americans. We need the Saudis and a strong Saudi Arabia to balance Iran on everything from Yemen to oil sanctions. It's simply not in our national interest to weaken the Saudis. Contrast that with the coalition of liberals and isolationists and even some self-described neoconservatives who regularly attack Saudi Arabia, including and especially in Congress. I ask you a simple question. What does weakening Saudi Arabia and strengthening the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, what does that do to advance American national interests? Those are the questions we should be asking. Among all of these baskets, enemies, rivals, problematic allies, you may find grievous human rights abuses. Whether in China, where hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs languish in re-education camps, or in Venezuela, where Maduro is oppressing his own people, or Ortega in Nicaragua, torturing and murdering those speaking for freedom. Or Islamist militias in Africa killing and raping and pillaging across the land. Or the women and homosexuals and religious dissidents who continue to suffer persecution in Saudi Arabia. These atrocities and countless more around the world rightly raise the hackles of every good American. We are a country that wants to see injustice smashed wherever it lies. Here's a simple fact. We cannot invade all the world to set it right. As it has been said many times, we are not the world's policemen. But there is also great force in America's principles, in loudly and unapologetically advocating those principles. Reagan didn't bomb the Berlin Wall into dust. His words inspired millions to render it to dust of their own accord. We can be a beacon among the nations. We can assume that old responsibility from the first days of our republic to lead the world to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to protect the fundamental dignity of every human being. We should be highlighting human rights abuses every way we can, rhetorically and through legislation where possible. Last year, we successfully passed my Nicaraguan Investment Conditionality Act, which imposes sanctions on Ortega and his regime for human rights abuses. Several years ago, the Senate also unanimously passed my legislation to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Plaza, after the wrongfully imprisoned Nobel laureate. That idea echoes one implemented by Reagan, who renamed the street in front of the Soviet embassy Sakharov Plaza, after yet another imprisoned Nobel laureate. That proposed legislation shone an uncomfortable light on China's human rights abuses. And it helped pressure China to finally release Liu's widow, Liu Xia. Likewise, when Sudan imprisoned and sentenced to death Miriam Ibrahim for the crime of being a Christian, America needed to speak out. I championed her cause, along with millions of believers across the world. Sadly, despite my repeated efforts, I could never convince President Obama even to say her name. But nonetheless, the light and attention of others was strong enough, and Sudan relented, releasing her from prison and allowing her and her husband to come to America. We need to speak out clearly, repeatedly, consistently, where people are imprisoned for being a Christian, as happens too often in Pakistan or Iran, or for fighting for free speech, as happens too often in China and Cuba and Venezuela. Now that we've completed our worldwide tour, let me close by coming back home. Who in Washington will approach the world the way I've described? Who will put America's national interest first? Forging a strong, just, and intelligent foreign policy is, at this moment, a critical responsibility of the Republican Party. In this endeavor, we can and we ultimately need Democratic allies. Many of my Democratic colleagues privately yearn for sanity in our foreign policy, and I welcome them with open arms. Some, like Bob Menendez, faced vicious retribution from the Obama administration when he dared speak out against the catastrophic Iran nuclear deal. Others, like Joe Lieberman, who was the only Democrat to have joined me and other Republicans in Jerusalem for the opening of our embassy, have been virtually excommunicated from their party. There was a time when Scoop Jackson Democrats were more commonplace. But sadly, as a group, leftists in Congress and in the media now have one standard of judgment when it comes to anything from border walls to how they take their coffee. If President Trump supports it, we hate it. And if he hates it, we support it. Thus, last night, at the State of the Union address, virtually every Democrat in Congress sat stone-faced when the president referenced pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. Thus, last night, virtually every single Democrat refused to applaud moving our embassy to Jerusalem, despite the fact that most of them claimed to support that policy just a few short years ago. So it falls on the rest of us, a coalition of the willing, to establish a new era of American foreign policy that leaves those overtly political motivations behind us. Wanting to avoid war does not make one a coward or weak. Wanting to stop terrorists and protect against hostile regime does not make one a warmonger. The longer we argue in these terms, the harder it is to develop a cohesive standard of action for the 21st century. Those who came here today expecting a forceful rebuke of the current administration might be disappointed. But with its relentless focus on American greatness, concern for the wishes of regular American families, and skepticism of military intervention, the Trump administration is primed to be a great incubator for a national interest-based foreign policy, if it has the right leaders and mentors and advisors and friends. We cannot squander this opportunity to set right generations of confusion we've inherited from both parties. It's an opportunity that is greater than all of our differences. As I've said, a national interest foreign policy is not some strange middle point between intervention and isolation, because it doesn't exist on the same axis. It isn't a cookie cutter that prescribes the same action to every situation, but it's a pragmatic standard of judgment under which some situations merit force, some the soft touch of diplomacy, and some no involvement at all. The principles of national interest have been advocated by great conservative thinkers long before Ronald Reagan's presidency. Indeed, all the way back to George Washington, we can find its roots. Its banner is a Gadsden flag, emblazoned with the legend, with the standard, "Don't tread on me." That's a standard well worth our consideration once more. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. So we'll have a brief discussion, and then we'll leave time for some questions from the audience. The last few weeks, it seems as though Congress has been a little more assertive than usual on some of these foreign policy issues. What do you think is going on? Is there some sort of shift or reason for this?
Well, I think the Democrats are in a position where they always want to rebuke the president. And sadly, right now, almost everything we're seeing in Congress from the Democratic side is driven by hatred for him. And so they're opposing things they previously supported. I think you also see, so with regards, the kind of two recent flashpoints have been Saudi Arabia and Syria. On both of those, I think you see daylight between some of the interventionists in the Republican conference and the administration. So I think you're seeing a temporary alliance between Republican interventionists and Democrats. At the end of the day, though, I don't think either one is asking the right questions. So let's take for example, as I referenced the Saudis. Look, what they did to Khashoggi was horrible. I mean, it seemed like a rejected episode of 24, where they lured him in and hacked him up to pieces. And we should be unequivocal saying that. We should use the bully pulpit of America to make clear that no, you should not be luring people in and murdering them. But at the same time, if we're focused on American interest, I don't even know how you articulate that it is better for America to weaken the Saudis and strengthen Iran. Because one or the other will be on ascendancy. And so I think efforts to weaken the Saudis rather than to use the bully pulpit, I think those are misguided.
Now, on the issue of Syria and Afghanistan, you were one of, I think, only 3 Republicans to vote against the amendment. The issue of, quote-unquote, precipitous withdrawal. Can you explain your views on that?
I can. And listen, with both Syria and Afghanistan, I would say I maintain an open mind. I think there are far too many commentators, for example, that took the president's announcement of withdrawal from Syria as calamity. You had on the Democratic side, whatever the president says is calamity, so they're happy to fall into that. But you had a lot of folks on the Republican side as well. Listen, with regard to Syria, I long have opposed intervening in the Syrian civil war. And it's worth noting why, actually. Let me take a digression in history and then come back to the question you raised. Let's go back to the Obama administration. When Obama was president, he proposed striking Syria with a military strike. At the time, I kept an open mind. I said, all right, I want to hear from the commander-in-chief, how does this advance our national security interest? I'm willing to hear those arguments, but present them to the Senate, present them to the American people, make the case, which I would note goes back to reasserting the Senate's authority to focus foreign policy. And the Obama administration's explanation, they wavered between points of incoherence. At one point, John Kerry famously said, we're going to do an unbelievably small strike. And I remember scratching my head going, well, how is that possibly beneficial? But the critical question I kept asking is, I said, okay, let's suppose this strike is actually effective. That you succeed in toppling Assad. Look, Assad is a monster. He's murdered hundreds of thousands of his own people. And we should be unequivocal in saying that as well. But the question I asked is, all right, if you topple Assad, how do you stop his chemical weapons from falling into the custody of radical Islamic terrorists, of Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra, of ISIS? Which, by the way, is a much worse circumstance. If we were dealing with ISIS with a massive stock of chemical weapons, we would be facing American soldiers horribly burned and murdered. Obama administration never had an answer to that. And so I kept an open mind to hear their justifications. At the end, they couldn't justify how intervening made America safer. And so I opposed that intervention. By the way, I could have imagined them coming forward and saying, all right, Assad has this cache of chemical weapons in this location. We believe a precision strike can either take those chemical weapons out or we can seize them to make sure that terrorists don't get them. I can imagine a scenario where the military intelligence made sense for military action focused at stopping a potential threat to America. But simply what the Obama administration does was effectively a press release. They wanted to go into the faculty rooms and say, tut, tut, and not actually defend American interests. So let's fast forward to now. We've had a military force in Syria and Iraq in order to defeat ISIS. It is extraordinary. And by the way, shame on the press for not covering this nearly enough. 2 years ago, ISIS had a self-declared caliphate extending across Iraq and Syria and was a profoundly serious national security threat. Today, we have taken virtually every square inch of that land from them. Now, ISIS remains dangerous. They are a terrorist organization. They could strike today, as could Al-Qaeda. But they do so now without a nation state behind them. They do so now without billions of oil revenues behind them. So they are weakened and less dangerous today. That mission has been completed, defeating and taking away ISIS's nation state. Now, does that mean ISIS is defeated for all time? No. But one question that is perfectly reasonable to ask, that I'm glad the president's asking, is what is our mission? What is our objective in Syria? Is it just to stay there forever and ever? Look, some of my Republican colleagues, I think their answer would be yes. They're happy to leave our troops on a foreign theater forever and ever and ever. I don't think that's right. And so I vote. The Senate took up a resolution condemning the president for wanting to bring our troops home. I voted against it. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think we should bring every soldier home. In both Syria and Afghanistan, I think there is an important counterterrorism mission to be carried out, especially Afghanistan, where you have many of the radical Islamic terrorists who have clustered, particularly in Pakistan. And having our military in a position to strike and take out terrorists who've declared war on America, that makes military sense. But for any troop deployment, there needs to be a clearly defined mission and objective. And I thought the Senate's rebuking the administration and saying, no, you can never take our soldiers out of Syria, I thought that was a mistake, and that's why I voted no.
Do you worry that in a case like Afghanistan, with the current negotiations, if the U.S. does end up withdrawing, that the outcome could be the Taliban simply takes over and we're back to square one?
I do. Look, I was not applauding last night when the president described happy negotiations with the Taliban. I was not applauding with happy negotiations with Kim in North Korea. I think both of those have the potential to prove to be fraught with danger. And I do not think anyone in government should be naive about the ill intentions of the Taliban or Kim Jong-un.
Yeah. On the role of the Senate, you mentioned one possibility, for example, actually using force against Iran if it comes to that. Is that on the president's own authority? Does he have the authority to do that, or would that require a declaration of war from Congress?
So the line there, the Constitution divides the war-making authority. So the power to declare war is given to Congress. And I believe we should exercise it and treat that obligation seriously. That being said, the president is the commander-in-chief of our armed forces, and the Constitution ascribes the president the authority to direct our military. Where that most often comes up is where there's a clear and imminent threat. Where there is a threat that the president has inherent authority under Article 2 to act to prevent a clear and imminent threat. So if an Iran, if a North Korea is on the verge of either acquiring nuclear weapons or, even worse, using nuclear weapons, Commander-in-Chief unquestionably has the authority to act to prevent that. Where that authority wanes is if the proposal shifts to a ground force invasion and extended military conflict, that's when you need congressional authorization. So when it comes to Iran, I think we should use all the tools we have. I think we should use maximum economic pressure, which we've seen has weakened the regime substantially. I think we should be supporting the Iranian people who bravely have stood in the streets protesting against the oppression of the mullahs. But I think we also need to be unequivocal that if Iran continues to seek nuclear weapons and gets close, that we're prepared to use military force to take it out. And one of the advantages of that clarity, this goes back to the point before, that part of the reason you want a strong military is not to have to use it. The best chance of deterring bad conduct is if the Iranians or North Koreans know that if they go down that road, the result is unacceptable to them.
I know I believe it's fair to say you're a free trader over the years. Mm-hmm. And again, in the Constitution, the phrase is something like regulating foreign commerce. Is that the president's right to impose tariffs, or does Congress have to weigh in on this? Does he have the ability to do this?
So on the question of tariffs, in the Trump administration, there are conflicting voices on this issue. This issue is probably, free trade, the most significant, persistent disagreement between virtually all of the Republican senators and the president, is the question of free trade and what we should be doing. There are voices within the Trump administration. Some voices are advocating for working to tear down the barriers of other countries to our goods and services, opening up, accessing other countries. For example, when the president talked about reducing the barriers to the Chinese markets and selling our goods and services there, standing up to the Chinese, both Republicans and Democrats stood and applauded last night. There are other voices in the administration that want to erect barriers to our own markets, want to use tariffs as a way to reduce trade. I disagree with those voices. I have weighed in vigorously in the direction of more trade and not less trade. I'm glad the administration leans in against countries like China because I think they impose a host of particularly non-tariff barriers to keep U.S. goods and services out. And we have seen for too long administrations scared or unwilling to take them on. But I am concerned about the unilateral imposition of tariffs hurting American jobs, hurting in Texas. There are about 2.2 million jobs in Texas that depend on international trade, whether it's farmers, whether it's ranchers, whether it's manufacturers. You know, come down to the Rio Grande Valley. You'll see factory after factory after factory on the American side providing good jobs that depend on trade. And so, now your question was one of authority. Unfortunately, Congress in previous decades, and in its great wisdom, has abdicated its authority in this area as well and has given the executive broad unilateral authority. I think that was a mistake. But it is the law. It is in the United States Code. It was passed legitimately. And so under existing federal law, the president has wide unilateral authority with regard to tariffs and trade. That makes it more perilous because it's simply a persuasion game. And I'll tell you, Colin, one of the reasons it's a persuasion game, one of the least remarked phenomenons of the last 2 years is the demise of the free trade Democrat. There used to be vocal advocates for free trade in the Democratic caucus. The last vocal free trade Democrat in the Senate was Hillary Clinton. And in 2016, she got vigorously demagogued from the left by Bernie Sanders. Nearly lost the nomination. Now look, her husband signed NAFTA. And I think all the other Democratic senators looked at what was happening to Hillary and they said, I don't want that to happen to me. And so as we sit here right now, I don't know a single Democrat in the Senate who I would characterize as vocally free trade. That means, in all likelihood, we don't have a supermajority in the Senate to stop almost anything the president does on trade. That means we are reduced to making the case within the administration, between the warring advisors, and hoping that the advocates of greater trade prevail.
We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Let's see. Here. You can bring up a microphone, please. Yes.
Thank you. Rita Chen from Central News Agency, Taiwan. Thank you. My question is that, Senator, I remember that you co-sponsored the Taiwan Travel Act last year, right? And then President Trump also signed into the law. So I'm just wondering that do you have any plan or idea to carry out the Taiwan Travel Act? Will you support President Tsai, President of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, to visit Washington, D.C. and deliver her speech in the Congress? Is it a good time or good idea to doing this year? Thank you.
So let me start with the second part of your question. Yes, I support President Tsai coming and delivering a speech to Congress. Indeed, I just recently signed a letter urging the Speaker of the House to invite her. When she came to Houston some time ago, I met with her one-on-one, and I will say I was thoroughly amused prior to the meeting to receive a letter from the PRC. The government of China asked me, please don't meet with President Tsai. And look, anyone who knows me would know that such a correspondence is unlikely to be successful. But I had great fun responding to that letter and explaining to the government of China that I will meet with whoever I damn well please. And they have no authority to dictate who I meet with, any more than I have authority to dictate who they meet with. But beyond that, listen, I think the people of Taiwan, you want to talk about an extraordinary story of standing up against Chinese oppression and creating an economic jewel, an economic powerhouse. You want an illustration of whether freedom or totalitarianism works, compare Taiwan and China side by side. And so in my time in the Senate, I have consistently worked to be the leading defender of Taiwan in the Senate. The Senate Armed Services Committee, year after year after year, I've introduced legislation, some of which has passed, some of which has not, to strengthen our relationship with Taiwan. And I think standing with our allies against, in this case, China would fall into the basket that I described as a rival. China is constantly trying to press Taiwan into submission, constantly trying to stifle Taiwan, constantly maintaining the fiction of a one China policy. And I think speaking out, look, the meeting I had with President Tsai, I think was positive and beneficial, and I hope to see her come to Washington and deliver an address here in Congress.
Right here. Up in the front here.
Hello, my name's Fred Bonig. I'm from the Daily Ripple. I'm also a Gold Star dad. I lost a son in 2010 in Afghanistan. In 2011, we had another son hit with a hand grenade. We have a son who's a Marine, and our daughter just finished her service with the Navy. And I'm asking you this because I'm kind of confused on something, and I've been following you for a long time. In 2015, the Mercers supported you, and you were involved with Cambridge Analytica in 2000, and they were obviously found to be helping with supporting Russian information, giving information to the Russians. And then in 2017, you and Senator Cornyn and Lindsey Graham all came out and stood against, making sure that the sanctions stayed on Russia. And then in 2018, you ran against Beto, which then you went back to the Mercers to get money, I guess. That was what was reported. Well, that's what it said, that you had contacted them. That's what I read. And then now you've taken away the sanction. You're voted against sanctions, and I'm just confused. I don't understand why we would ever do that, take away the sanctions on the Russians at this point.
Well, let me start by saying thank you for your family service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for multiple service, both your children living and those you have lost. On the question of Russia, I think there is a great deal of political dishonesty going on right now. Look, my positions on Russia have been clear and unequivocal from the day I entered the Senate. Russia are not our friends. Putin is a KGB thug. And I have articulated that over and over and over again in clear and unequivocal terms. In the Senate, I have consistently advocated policies to strengthen how we stand up to Russia. So, for example, the sanctions that we have in place, I co-sponsored, voted for, advocated for. Those sanctions were important. Much of the political dishonesty we're seeing right now is you have Democrats, as I discussed, who suddenly discovered Russia as an enemy. Some of us still remember Barack Obama leaning over to Medvedev and saying, "Tell Vladimir I'll have much more flexibility after the election." I spent years in the Obama administration trying to make the case to the Obama administration Russia was a threat to almost complete and utter lack of receptivity. Now, personally, I wish President Trump were willing to be clearer and more unequivocal in his language about Russia and Putin. I don't understand why he won't. I have urged him to, both publicly and privately, to use the bully pulpit more effectively against Russia. He has not been willing to do so. That being said, I will say if you compare the actual policy that has been enacted under the Trump administration and Obama administration vis-a-vis Russia, by any measure, the Trump administration's policies are much more vigorous to standing up to Russian aggression. The rhetoric isn't, but the substance is. For example, we have in place, it is Congress. But it is Congress to be sure, and part of it is suddenly the Democrats were willing to support us because they saw it as rebuking Trump. So we magically had a bipartisan majority that was produced not on substance but on an antipathy for the office holder. But we have also seen, for example, providing lethal weaponry to Ukraine, which, by the way, I traveled to Ukraine. I met with leadership there. I made the case repeatedly to the Obama Defense Department that we ought to be providing lethal weaponry to Ukraine. They wouldn't do it. The Trump administration has. Now, that has been them. They have done that. So that is, you want to talk about a concrete step helping enable our allies to stand up to Russian aggression. That is a concrete step. Another concrete step that the president did is he went to Europe and made the case to the Europeans against building the Nord Stream pipeline, which would enrich Putin and the Russians. And he made the case right to Angela Merkel, right to the Europeans who were building it. Why are you funneling billions to prop up this regime? You know, John McCain had a great phrase for Russia. He described Russia as a gas station with a country attached. And by the way, the single most potent thing we've done against Russia has been the shale revolution. In the United States, as the president said last night, America is now the #1 producer of oil and the #1 producer of natural gas in the world. That has dramatically reduced the power of Putin as a petro-tyrant. It is those petrodollars that have fueled his military aggression. So on substance, I think we've made significant steps in the right direction. By the way, with regard to the sanctions that were lifted, I'm going to give credit to the Democrats for some very clever politics. Because in this instance, we had a Russian oligarch we had imposed sanctions against. Pursuant to Congress's legislation, the Treasury Department had imposed sanctions. The terms of the sanctions said the sanctions will remain in place unless and until the oligarch reduces his control, no longer has control of the companies in question. Well, what happened is they, in fact, reduced their control, provided provisions that he couldn't receive dividends, that he couldn't vote his shares, and they complied with the terms of the sanctions. And so Treasury came to us, and Treasury came to us and made the case on the merits that if we're going to impose sanctions that say these sanctions will occur until you do X, when a company actually does X, we need to lift the sanctions. If we're going to have them be effective, we need to be able to have a clear path to here's how you get out of them. That was the case they made, and so that's why I voted in that instance, because they had complied with the terms of the sanctions. But it was great politics for the Democrats. The Democrats, I don't think, expected that what they voted on would pass, but it let them say, see, all these Republicans are supporting Russian oligarchs. I mean, it was Washington politics. It was pretty effective. I mean, I sort of laughed at it and said, all right, that was well done. But I think on the substance and merits, if you're going to have sanctions and say this is the path to lift them, then you, in fact, if they go back and start violating the sanctions can and should be reimposed. But Treasury made a case that I found persuasive on the merits that we should actually honor the terms of sanctions that were imposed. Those are the terms of the agreement. And by the way, if he violates those terms, we should impose the sanctions again. So yeah.
I'm getting the out-of-time signal. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm going to ask the audience to please stay seated so that Senator Cruz can get right back to work. And please join me in thanking him